I'm Kelly Lewis.
And I'm Tiffany Jones, and we're your Revenue Insiders.
If you're enjoying the Revenue Insiders, we'd love your support. Follow us, rate, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Your feedback helps us grow and reach more listeners like you.
Hi, we are here to wrap up our annual planning series that we have been doing for the last several weeks. I'm really excited to talk about it. Annual planning is wrapping up for most people right now, and so hopefully talking about the actual execution steps is timely for you. I'm really excited to dig into. Kelly, you and I have such different experiences with the execution of the annual plan from an operational versus an enablement perspective. So I think this is going to be really fun to kind of talk through the different ways that we see the execution phase.
Absolutely. I've talked to a couple revenue leaders this week, and I had to laugh because so many of them said, oh yeah, we had a strategy, we had a plan. And then, the week before Christmas, we changed everything. And I was like,
Yeah.
yep, that sounds about right. That's
Yeah.
normal. That happens. You try to
Why you
avoid
keep
it.
a decision log. You got to keep a decision log.
Things come up and that happens. So yeah, let's talk about once you actually finalize those decisions, how do you execute on your annual planning so that both your operations team is good to go and your reps and anyone in the field feels prepared to tackle the next year. So we're going to kind of handle this in two different sections. The first section, we're going to talk specifically about operations. What do they need to do? What are the best practices there? Tiffany clearly has more experience here. I'll talk about what I've seen also that works well. And then we're going to jump into enablement. Both of us have a lot of enablement experience, and we'll talk about different trends we're seeing. I've seen shift a lot in the last couple of years. And so I'm excited to talk about modernizing how you enable for annual planning.
I mean, I think it's a play off your 2025 prediction of like gone are the days of 3 days, like heads down enablement sessions. Sneak peek, more to come.
More to come, more to come. Okay, Tiffany. So since this is a world you live in every day, you've nailed down your key decisions for annual planning. You now have the operations team and they need to get running and rolling with everything that's been decided. Talk to me about how you think about that and how you operationalize that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things that we glossed over in our last few series is while you're making all of those decisions, you actually have your operational team building out the framework for building on those. So you might be, 90% done on decisions, but you've communicated that down. They've started building the territory plans, or they've started modifying the rules of engagement document, or changing your Salesforce instance to account for new workflows that need to be there. So you should start that process ahead of being done. Number one, that's my first tip, because if you wait till the end, you're going to kill your operations team, and no one wants to be in that situation. But really, we're, end of the first full week of January, like crunch time for all the teams that are on end of January fiscal year right now, because now this is where operations like rubber meets the road. So from here, you need a really solid day-to-day stand-up plan on how you are getting all of these things in the systems. There are so many things that are working against you. The end of the fiscal year and the needs that your reps might have for you to actually close the fiscal year are going to start to get in the way with the needs to get these things executed. And for me, I think the biggest success metric isn't getting all of these things out Feb 1. Everyone is taking, or whatever your first day of your fiscal year is, like everyone's taking a big breath that day. People are taking time off. No one is planning to hit the ground running day 1. And so it's not the earliest that's feasibly possible to get comp plans and territory plans and rules of engagements out the door, but instead to commit to a date and stick to it. So whatever that date is that is reasonable for your team, that has some buffer built into it for the unknowns, because trust me, 15 years in, unknowns happen every single year. Like, you cannot plan around them. But find the date that works and stick to it. And that is the biggest metric of success, is can you stick to that date that you said? And that's really like the important work that's happening right now, is all of the fine tuning of those final things to kind of get everyone to, on the back end, to fall in line with what you've just created strategically.
Totally. Where I've seen this breakdown in so many areas is, one, you don't stick to that date and you lose the trust of your sales team. As a salesperson, the first thing you care about is your comp plan. And the more and more you delay it, you lose motivation every day. because they want to know what are they being measured on and how are they going to make money. So if you can stick to those dates and be really transparent about it, it's really important. The other place where I see this broken down is when ops and enablement don't partner well together at this point. Because
100%.
yeah, when operations is actually turning these ideas and concepts into reality, they're starting to think through that. But if enablement doesn't get early previews to that and is involved in that and in the mindset of the reps saying, hey, reps are going to ask about this. We thought about this. Reps are going to ask about this. If those two teams aren't really partnered closely, you're going to find yourself in a situation where ops is executed and there's this really long drag between when enablement can then execute on their piece. So I think you probably have your own operations stand up, but you probably need an operations enablement stand up that's happening every day, every other day as well.
I totally agree. And we oftentimes, like coming from the ops side of my world, like we minimize the enablement effort that's needed because the change feels minimal from our perspective. And when you do that, when you look at it from just an operational perspective, you don't give credit to the rest of the change management that the field needs to go through. And this becomes like, even if it's just like one more, like another straw on the camel's back situation, like you need to package all of that change very cohesively so that they can absorb it all. But you also sometimes minimize it might be you've changed a workflow to accommodate this strategy and now there's 3 clicks to create an opportunity instead of one that there was, but it makes sure like all these things generate or the right people get added. Those additional 3 clicks can be very painful for the field. They may not understand why or how to do it, even though it feels obvious to you as someone who lives and breathes in the Salesforce system. And so I do totally agree that you have to bring in the enablement team as early as possible so that you're wrapping that all into one package. And the biggest takeaway for me is you want to be one voice to the field. You want to feel like one impact to the field and not a bunch of changes that every department is layering on for what they're doing for this year.
That actually leads me into my next discussion point, which is around managers and how you present to managers. One point of view that I have is that when you initially present to your second line and your first line management team, it has to come from United Front. It has to be your CRO, but it also has to be your head of enablement, your head of operations, your VPs of sales. They all need to be sharing this united story and vision together,
Mhm.
so that people can get bought in. Where I see it break down is when individual teams are sharing this information with their own teams, and it comes across as ops is doing this to
Yes.
us, or sales is mandating this versus we as United leadership team have decided this is what is best for our organization, and we're excited to roll it out.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And we talked to Rob about this going back to one of our prior episodes, but the layers in which you engage different levels of management, again, it starts happening earlier because you have things like territory management that they need to absorb as part of the process. But then you have to, I think what I've fallen into this trap before, you take that communication that happened, say 6 weeks ago for granted, and you forget that you need to repackage it as like, here's the holistic plan now. Like you got some views of the operational plan, maybe some data around like what the numbers are, but like you need to back that back up and say, here's the rest of the strategic company plan and how you exactly as you described it, waterfall it down so that everyone is in lockstep on the same page on what you're going to execute. I'm curious, Kelly, when you think about that, like what are the modes of communication that you've seen be successful from an enablement perspective in doing that waterfall of communication?
Absolutely. I think it has to be a live Zoom, in person, whatever your scenario is at your office meeting where you actually get up and talk about these changes. But you can't just do it once. It has to happen multiple times and multiple layers of looks like. One thing that I think is really important when it comes to communication, and this should start with the ops and the enablement team very early, is creating an FAQ. And I want
Mm,
to be very clear, I'm not saying an FAQ is an enablement document. It is not. But
never.
never. But it is vital. And the reason the FAQ document is vital is it starts with a couple phases. First, enablement goes in and says, okay, I've got my view of my sellers, my support team, my customer success team. These are the questions I know they're going to ask. And here's what I think the answers are. And they go in and create that first step. And then ops helps them, create those answers along with sales leadership. And then the second layer is, okay, your managers come in and they say, well, I don't understand this. Give me the answer. But also, these are the 10 questions my reps are going to ask me. get those documented immediately in the FAQ and come up with a united answer that everyone agrees to, or everyone at least can align to, so that as a manager, when you get asked one of these 10 hard questions, you can go in and easily find the answer and then translate that to your team member.
Yeah. I mean, again, it goes back to the point you made at the beginning on why the FAQ is important, is like being on the same page. Like once you have someone who is not blaming other teams, I don't think that's not normally the intention, but kind of like pointing to
Not the
this is
intention, but maybe the reality.
yeah, yeah. That's how maybe we feel on the back end sometimes. But like when the it comes from a point of view of this is happening to us versus like look what we're doing together, it resonates so differently, I think, for the field as a holistic entity versus individual teams feeling like, well, op said we don't get these accounts anymore. They're going over to this other team. So you can expect all these accounts to move is like not the framing you want. And so when someone asks what happened to my X number of accounts I used to own, having an FAQ that really well explains that territory process, for example, and like the why behind it, while it's not an enablement doc, I do think it helps keep everyone on the same page leading up
Absolutely.
to like rollouts of actual enablement.
Different than in past years. 2025 is a different year in that you can now feed these FAQ documents into your enablement platform or whatever your
Mhm.
content management solution is. And in most cases, you can do a Q&A with that system to find that answer. So you're not digging through a 100-page document trying to find your answer. Through the use of search and AI, you're able to quickly and easily find that. So I think the use of an FAQ becomes a little bit different
That's so
because you've been
interesting.
able to document those answers.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that use case. And, I love my AI topic, but no, I think you're totally right. It's like, how do you frame your FAQs so that you get your sellers, you give an answer, but you get people to use your tools and like the more LLM search engines and you have to make sure that the right answers are going to come up too.
Yeah, totally. You don't want any fake answers.
I wonder too, that brings up a really interesting point. I wonder if as an enablement or even an ops leader, as you're starting to build that, like, do you flow those FAQs or like some points about your strategy into an AI tool and ask it what the sellers are going to ask questions about? Like, is there an opportunity to introduce even a third layer of like what you just went through of like raising the hand of enablement and then managers? Like, I wonder if I haven't tried it,
I
but
love that. Have not tried it.
yeah,
Someone should try this and let us know how it goes, but
yeah,
absolutely you should because AI is trained to ask prompt questions to dig deeper. And
yeah.
so why wouldn't you use them that way?
Yeah, it seems like the perfect use case. So
Or like, hey, this answer actually does. You might think it explains the answer because you know the details, but without knowing those details, this answer doesn't make sense. I
yeah,
love that.
exactly. So,
Great use
okay.
case. Great use case. Okay. The other one I think is really important is that you start a manager only Slack channel, Teams channel, whatever that looks like for your organization, where you have certain people that are on call. A tiger team is what we used to call them at High Spot that are available to answer those questions in a pretty timely manner. So you start with that manager only channel at first. And then as you roll out to your reps, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, what that looks like, but you would create one for your reps as well.
Okay. So we have, we call it our revenue leadership channels for our whole revenue team. Do we use that channel or do you spin up a specific one that then gets like archived post the whole end of this? Like, what is the better practice there?
So I like to compartmentalize a little bit. And I think you want to keep those leadership channels available and free of the
Mhm.
monotony and the questions that are coming in for planning. And I think it's also just a mindset. I know I have a place to go about all of this
Yeah.
versus putting a question that you might feel scared to ask in a normal form. But because you know this is a channel
Defined it.
specific to annual planning, you can feel comfortable asking, I don't want to say the dumb questions, but like those questions that you are concerned might be more obvious to others.
We have a large number of Slack channels. We are a
Oh,
heavy
what?
Slack
No, I've never heard
user.
of that.
Very low on email, very high on Slack. And so one of the things that I actually get from a comms perspective a lot of the times is there's too many Slack channels. Like I can't keep
Totally.
up. And so I do think you have to assess what your leaders need. Like I don't think there's a one size fits all. I like your perspective on that. And I agree. And I tend to be a creator of Slack channels for that very purpose. But I also have to listen to my leaders and what they're asking me for. And they're saying, like, I can't take another Slack channel.
Yeah.
Like, please just like consolidate it. And I haven't looked into this again, like thinking on the fly here, like, can I rename my Slack channel for this period of time? Like, because really the majority of what I'm talking to my revenue leadership team about in February, for me, that started my fiscal year, is just this. There's not a lot of
Yeah.
other topics happening. But yeah, I think segmenting it out adds a lot of value, and it allows you to archive it when you're done. And so from like a data protection perspective, like just you don't need that information after the first like 6 weeks of the new year. So why bother retaining it versus letting it kind of live on in perpetuity in a existing channel?
One question I often see from a seller or from a leader, and actually they don't always ask the question, but you wish they would, is okay, so I've got a question. I'm just going to go log a ticket. But ops teams oftentimes would rather have this tiger team that's just quickly agile answering questions versus getting a backlog of 100 questions that go into a silo. No one else can learn from those
Yeah.
answers. I do think it's really important that your enablement team and your leaders are very clear with everyone on the different use cases. Hey, something is broken. Great. Log a ticket for that. But hey, you just have a general question. Your peer probably does too. So make sure you ask that in the public channel so we can all learn from each other.
Yeah, and going back to the ops team burnout that like is really high, high likelihood during this time frame of all the work to do, that post deployment questions component is another part of that. And there's a balance between, right, you want people to have shared answers. And so like a forum, like a Slack or a Teams channel enables you for people to search on their own, and FAQ helps with that as well. But the value of tickets is you can enforce SLA and give that confidence back to the field, and you can track how much work your ops team is doing, so you know how bogged down they are. That gets we do some ticketing stuff actually through Slack, and I haven't found a good way to do metrics around how much work my team is doing. I can see it, like I can see it from a subjective standpoint, and so another one where like I think you just have to know your team to know what the right balance is between what you're doing in a channel and what you're thinking about like asking generically versus when you point people back to those to an actual like case
Feel
type.
like Slack has probably solved this.
They probably have. I hope that
Talk
Alex,
to
if
your
you're
rep.
out there
There's got to be
listening,
something there.
yeah.
The other thing when I think about communication is office hours. So I
Mm,
oftentimes find that managers find it really helpful to get in a room and talk to each other about the questions they're getting and how each other are answering them from their perspective. So these are typically not mandatory, but I often find within the first couple of weeks, they all join them and they just want to hear like, hey, I'm getting this really hard question. How are you all answering this? And it's not enablement usually giving the answer. It's not ops oftentimes giving the answer. It's their peer saying, hey, so this was the language that was in the FAQ, but here's what I actually say that's resonating, or here's the analogy I'm using to make this translate easier to the team. And those one-on-one connections are really helpful. And a lot of sales leaders, when they get their teams on calls, they're talking about deals and they're going. And so they're not creating that environment to ask those safe questions. And so
mm,
I think creating that, I think it's up to enablement and ops to create those meetings where they can
yeah,
do those one-to-one
those
conversations.
spaces, sure, they need that space. So I'm curious, we're talking a lot about the forums for communication. Like, when does this communication start relative to the end of your fiscal year? Is this all
Oh,
like around your kickoff, which is normally like the back half of the first month average, let's call it? Is it the end of your fiscal year when they're all trying to close deals? Like, what's the sweet spot here for
this is a
communication?
hard one. I do believe you need to give your managers a preview prior to the beginning of the year. And I think you can do that in a way that's not super distracting. So kind of that like, hey, this is what's coming. Here's a heads up. We'll give you the details later. If there are big changes that are going to be hard to swallow and the behavior change is going to be something that's really difficult, wait till your new year to do that.
Well, new year for maybe frontline leaders. I think it's important
Yes.
if for some reason your theater leads have not been, your regional leads have not been included in some of those decisions to date, I do think they are senior enough to share the brain space of closing the year and having that. So I do think there's a difference in manager levels there.
Yeah. And that's where you start getting those FAQs filled out because you understand the questions that are
Yeah.
going to come up
Yeah. Yeah.
and make sure that you didn't miss something, frankly, because that happens too. I do have a pretty strong perspective, though, on what I'm going to call the annual planning rollout and your SKO.
They're one and the same, right?
Yeah, no, I completely disagree. So, this is my philosophy, and we tried this at my last job, and I think it was fairly successful. So, when you think about how a person learns, they have to do that initial knowledge transfer, and then they have to do the application and understand the application of whatever that knowledge transfer is. And then they have to do the actual behavior change and start practicing it. And I think a sales kickoff is a giant waste of money if you are using that for knowledge transfer. I have a really strong point of view that a lot of that initial knowledge transfer should be done prior to your in-person SK.
So you say initial, I think my point of view differs slightly from yours on
Yeah,
this.
and that's
I
fine.
see. Initial knowledge transfer, I agree with. Like the bulk knowledge transfer, I think, listen, you're at a kickoff, you're having drinks, you're mingling with people you never see anymore. Like whatever that environment looks like, regardless of like what you can absorb, you've lowered the bar by like 10 notches and what you actually have people set up for success to absorb. So I agree with you there. But I think you have to repeat things so many times for people to
Totally.
for it to click. And so yes, initial knowledge transfer, but then at least my approach, and there's no stopping this train now for this year, is like there's a repetitiveness to that knowledge transfer that is woven into the kickoff for sure. But first time hearing it, for most things outside of like big reveal type stuff that you might want that splashy in person. I don't know, I feel like that deserves an in-person moment sometimes. But yeah, I agree with like the initial knowledge transfer, the heavy knowledge transfer.
Yeah, I think when people come in and they know what's coming and they've had a second to start thinking about it, whether that's literally just on the plane to SKO or not, it means that they're going to have the ability to actually absorb it and start thinking about how they're going to apply it and practice it. So
Hmm.
my philosophy in what we actually tried at my last company was called Fast Start. So
Okay.
this was more of a virtual program and an initial rollout of comp plans, territory plans. We actually started updating on roadmap and what was coming with product
Mm,
launches, just so people could start thinking about the implications of that. And then when you get to SKO, don't have your executives on stage for 6 hours a day talking at people. You can have them on stage to do big reveals, and it should be visionary. Your SKO should absolutely be visionary, but that should be 25, 20%. And the rest, in my mind, should really be the practice and the application of whatever changes you're establishing, whether that's a new territory planning model, whether that's new messaging, whether that's a new roadmap discussion. Use those SKO moments for creating that really strong team culture, for that planning within your own territory and team. And then save those big moments for the executives to get on stage, have those at your SKO, but they should be short, bite-sized inspirational sessions and not these hour upon hour of someone
yeah.
sitting in a seat. You can do that at Zoom at home.
Right. Building on that, one of the things for we call it an RKO or a revenue kickoff. I think there's different
Yes,
names
totally.
for it across the
Go to
board.
market, kickoff, revenue, kickoff, SKO, whatever you want to call it.
So for our kickoff, one of the things I've designed as a KPI for us is not actually how much, like we're not certifying anyone coming out of kickoff. Like that's an unreasonable thing to do from my perspective for a lot of the reasons that you just listed. I don't think you're going to absorb enough information to be like an expert unless you really dedicate like multiple days to a single topic. And I don't think that's the goal. For me, the goal, similar to what you're describing, is that we have excited the revenue team enough that they are motivated and hungry for more information. And that we measure how hungry they are by how quickly they take the next series of enablements that we roll out post kickoff. So if
That's great.
that's like deep product launch enablement, because that's what's coming down and that's your big reveal, that actual enablement's happening in your normal formats post RKO. And the faster people go through it or do their certification, I think is the signal you use to say, like, how successful was I in making them excited about it and motivating them that this is like the best new thing for us. And so that's one of the metrics we're using this year versus like how much we think people absorbed at the event itself.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. SKOs are so important, but I do think that the old world SKO of the executive getting up there and speaking and just sitting in that chair, I remember for hours just listening. And you're like, I didn't absorb any of that. I have thousands of questions. There was no form to ask those questions. That's just not helpful anymore. And I
Yeah.
think there's a better way to do it.
It's hard to, I mean, again, thinking about the factors that are working against you, like people are jet lagged. Like it's hard to sit still and stay alert. Like you feed them sugar in the snack break and then they crash. Like there's just no, like, there's no good way to do that. And we, last year at our kickoff, And this is partially like space is always like you have to navigate the space you have too. But we structured our whole day. First day, it was a lot of like sitting and listening. And it was panels and customers and peers. It wasn't just executives, but it was still sitting in a chair, facing forward and listening. And the second day was very practice oriented. And the feedback we got was exactly what you're saying. It was too much. Like by the fifth presentation, I couldn't take it anymore. Like it didn't matter that it was new content or it was, a different customer point of view. It didn't matter how excited I was. Like I just can't sit for that long and listen for that long.
Yeah, I've never been able to make it work because of space issues and just timing. But I think ideal is that you do a keynote, you do a practice, you do a keynote, you do a practice. And so that you're getting people up out of their seat. You're constantly having them engaging in whatever content was just rolled out. The logistics of that, my SKO team has never let me do. I love them to death. They're like, no, Kelly, we can't make that work. But I do think if you could make that work, that
Yeah.
is the ideal scenario.
Yeah, I agree. I think you have to, again, like you absorb a secondary piece of information that you've already learned on, and you use like if you've already absorbed how your territories are going to work from a prior to kickoff, then you apply the combination of those two things in like a practice, for example. Yeah, I mean, if you think about modalities of education, like different people need to learn in different ways, and you need to tailor your kickoff to all of those different learning styles as well. And so I think varying it, again, space being, not a concern, like layering it like that would be really helpful for that purpose as well.
So I really want to talk about what you do after your SKO, but not, because we have a very exciting guest coming up in a couple of weeks to talk about that. So we're going to hold that for another episode. So I think we jump to the next topic, which is the importance of a retrospective. This is something
Yes.
that I think everyone always plans to do, but very rarely happens. And very rarely is it done effectively and then looked at before the next year's annual planning. So how do you think about a retrospective? How have you run them in the past, and like what works and what doesn't work for you?
Yeah, I think that there are different retrospectives you do. So there's a retrospective you do on maybe the whole like execution plan itself, which often includes kickoff. And so I'm going to put that aside for our next conversation. Then there's the retrospective of the plan itself, like what actually worked in the plan that we did, and that has to be a 60, 90, 120-day retrospective, and probably in increments. Like what are your leading indicators that strategy is working? Because you want to know as soon as possible, again, back to the conversation we had with Rob on like if quotas aren't being met or like meetings aren't happening, like what are your leading indicators really within the sales organization that something is off with the strategy you deployed? And I think that the way you do that is by identifying KPIs up front. What are the things you're going to measure that you expect to have made a difference or to look a certain way? And then I don't think you wait till the next year. You change. You shift. It doesn't have to be big shifts, but you say, we thought that we would get X amount of pipeline or meetings in this new territory model, and we have these teams that are off. Like, what are the things, if all the other leading indicators are right, like we now need to convene up to your ELT team and say, like, we need to spend money and pull this lever over here because we can see that this isn't working. And so I think that that's the secret there is you don't wait until the next year. You act on that information immediately. The third one, though, is trickier. The third one's your operational retro. Like, how did you actually execute not to the field, but internally that strategy? How well did that work? That's the one that like I struggle with still. You have the retrospective, that ops team gets a lot of blame usually for like that, these Salesforce triggers didn't work or these accounts were assigned wrong or, my comp plan accelerators aren't working as they're supposed to. And again, a lot of those things are great to hold back and say like, oh, we can change this in territory planning next year or when we review the rules of engagement. But again, I think if you have a more agile approach of saying like, okay, if this isn't working in the comp plan, like we don't need to release all new comp plans, but how do I solve for this problem? And you almost just make it a project then and there to start trying to fix it versus again, holding it until the next year. But those are trickier, I think, than the strategy ones ultimately. What have
Totally. I
you
think there's so much that can be said for learning from your past and what worked and what didn't work. So I think having these retrospectives and then revisiting, like it should be the first part of your next year's planning session is to be like, here's just to remember what happened. Here's where things fell down. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't work. Here's how we recommended back then that we should tackle this year.
But I think one of the things that I've fallen victim to is you wait until too far into the planning cycle to pull those up, and you actually can't make those changes. So I'll lean on my operational expertise. Say that you said like our data in the EMEA region wasn't strong enough for what we wanted, and we have sloppy territories as a result, and some frustrated sales reps. And so we're going to say we're not changing it this year, but we're going to, we're going to do a cleanup in EMEA data specifically next year. If you don't remember to do that, again, let's lean on a fiscal year starting in February. By August, like 6 months
Totally.
prior, you've lost your window, and now you're back in the, like you said you were going to do it, and you're back in the same boat. I think the trick there is like, how do you don't file it away? Like, how do you make it front and center and like put dates essentially to it as you're doing your retro so that you know when you need to like pull that back up to look at it?
Absolutely. And I always consider that kind of like that ongoing annual planning that should be happening on a quarterly basis. The one thing I want to touch on that you said is that you should be making those changes right away. The only thing I will caution on that is sometimes you have to know what's reasonable to actually see a positive change. The thing I've seen at so many companies, I've fallen victim to this, is you're not seeing the immediate KPIs and you had unrealistic expectations of when you were going to see those changes. And so you go and make another update and you actually didn't give yourself the room to see if it was going to work. And so before you go make those changes or when you set those KPIs, make sure you're just setting realistic expectations, especially with your finance teams, with your ops teams, with the sales leaders. Okay, we've got a new plan, we've got a new territory, we've got whatever, we're doing a massive behavior change. We can expect to train the reps in February and March, but we're probably not going to see results till May, and we're all okay with that. And so I do think it's important that you just have realistic expectations, because the worst thing you can do is just constantly make changes without giving yourself the space to actually fully absorb the initial change.
I think one of the things you can do to combat that is you try to pull as much forward in the leading indicators as you can. So like it's really easy to say we're launching a new product. Here's like the training schedule. And so we expect like first sales like 2 months out or whatever that looks like. And here are the results we expect quarter over quarter. But how do you know that like what leads to sales, like opportunities, what leads to that meetings,
Totally.
like what is the click-through rate on the marketing campaign? So like as much as you can pull forward, I feel like you can give yourself ideas. And I agree, like, you don't wanna make a lot of fast changes, like, that's just overwhelming for the sense of change, like, the sake of change, and it's not helpful for anyone. But you do like, if it's not resonating, like, the messaging that you just worked really hard on isn't resonating or your sales plays aren't working, like, I
You got to
wanna
make
know that
updates.
as soon as possible because that's something I
Totally.
can shift and, like, do A/B testing on or, approach differently. And so, I think there's a balance there of, like, early enough KPIs, but holding on change until you're certain that you've gone the wrong direction, or maybe meaningful change is a good way to phrase it.
I like that. And I think those leading indicators have to be accepted and acknowledged by all the teams. I often find when I'm talking to organizations that what happens is everyone in sales and ops and on the revenue side says, yep, these are leading indicators. And here's when we expect to see this change actually start to make an impact.
Yeah,
And then you've got your finance team in the back being like, it's been 30 days.
numbers, like where's the
It's
money?
been 30 days. We're not seeing a change. It didn't work. And like calling failure, even though everyone else is still tracking for a completely different timeline. And that's where you're going to find yourself in a mess. So while they might feel like sales KPIs, make sure your friends over in finance are fully aware of like the
Finance,
timing.
product too. I get that
Yes,
pressure from
yes,
product. Like
absolutely.
their baby is out the door. Like obviously everyone wants it and it should be like flying off the shelves. And so yeah, I think product marketing, they're spending much time on campaigns and account-based marketing and like when they're not seeing the results. So I think it's like across the board, your cross-functional partners like definitely need to be aligned on those leading indicators and the kind of waterfall down of indicators you expect to see from a timing perspective.
Totally. Well, we are excited to announce that we are going to be launching an ebook on annual planning coming out very shortly. So, for those of you already starting to think forward to next year, this will be a great resource for you to use. We have captured all of the information shared by all of our amazing guests and put it together in a format that should be easy to read and follow as you head into the next year's planning. We also have a bunch of fun episodes coming up that talk about more about the execution of your next year.
Yeah, I'm super excited. We did our Q1 planning and we're here to execute. So It's gonna be
Yeah,
cool.
we got it. Well, thank you all for joining us on the annual planning mini series. It's been fun. I hope everyone learned something. We've learned from
I
you
did.
and your comments. So thank you for your engagement. Thanks, everyone. If you're enjoying the Revenue Insiders, we'd love your support. Follow us, rate, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Your feedback helps us grow and reach more listeners like you.